Hello, and welcome to part two of reading Charles Dickens's A Tale of Two Cities. I'm Dr. Christian Lehman, and we will be talking about book two, chapters 1 through 6 today. If you've read these chapters, you might be expecting a lot about the similarities between Charles Darnay and Sidney Carton. That will not necessarily be my focus today, as I'm far more interested in some otherwise obscure passages that show us quite a bit about the period in which this novel takes place. So this is going to be discussing the July 1859 installment, and I will move first through the passages, and then we'll end by looking at the illustrations, both Fizz's and John McLennan's. So to summarize what has happened in these chapters, in book two, The Golden Thread, chapter 1, it's called 5 Years Later. Basically, Jerry Cruncher is at Tellson's, and we learn a lot about Tellson's. Chapter 2, A Sight, Charles Darnay is on trial for treason. Chapter 3, A Disappointment, the details of Darnay's charges for treason. Sidney Carton looks like him. Chapter 4, Congratulatory, Charles Darnay is innocent. Woo! Sidney gets drunk. Ooh. Chapter 5, The Jackal, Sidney's not a lion, he's a jackal. He works for Stryver. Chapter 6, Hundreds of People. It's a weird chapter. The Manettes live in an echoing house. All right, we start right away with Tellson's and imperialism. Your lighter boxes of family papers went upstairs into a Barmecide room that always had a great dining table in it and never had a dinner and dinner, and where, even in the year 1780, the first letters written to you by your old love or by your little children were but newly released from the horror of being ogled through the windows by the heads exposed on Temple Bar with an insensate brutality and ferocity worthy of Abyssinia or Ashanti. But indeed, at that time, putting to death was a recipe, much in vogue with all trades and professions, and not least of all with Tellson's. Death is nature's remedy for all things. Why not legislations? So there's a few literary allusions that we need to cover here that activate that imperialism inside of here. Because remember, this is a bank, and its primary funds are going to be enriched by the British Empire. So a Barmecide room is a reference, a literary allusion to 1001 Nights, right? The Arabian Tales. Already a book that Dickens loves, but the references to it can be quite problematic given that it activates an orientalizing trope. In this, a rich man serves a poor man a non-existent dinner. So it's an imaginary feast is what it comes to stand in for. And so it's very peculiar, right, that we kind of say that this place where you think it's almost like a safety deposit box ends up being a place of absence. And then he moves to this peculiar bit at the end where you see these heads that go by, and we get this comparison to the insensate brutality and ferocity worthy of Abyssinia or Ashanti. So these are references to places in Africa during the height of the British Empire in the 1850s. And they're actually really topical allusions, as the Penguin note helps. So Abyssinia, modern Ethiopia, was a scene of a fatal encounter between British power and indigenous anger, as the note tells us. And earlier, British had meddled with the Ashanti in northern Ghana, and the British governor, actually named McCarthy, had been killed, and his skull became a drinking cup for a local war leader. So when Dickens uses these phrases, right, it's kind of as an aside in a paragraph, but it shows the ease with which he can make these references. And by calling it the brutality and ferocity worthy of the places in Africa, he sides with the British Empire being there, right? You could easily have the same sense of, oh, it's as brutal as the British occupying forces. But by not doing that, and instead labeling the local indigenous populations as the brutes and the people that are ferocious, he flips that and sides with the imperial mindset. He then activates this, though, when he says, following this, as he transitions to death penalty language. But indeed, at that time, putting to death was a recipe much in vogue with all trades and professions, and not least of all with elsons. Death is nature's remedy for all things, and why not legislations? Notice we have kind of this deed, death, would be capitalized if it were later in the sentence, and nature is also there, and then legislation, right? So we have three proper nouns that are working in kind of a complicated way together, as Dickens tries to say that the local laws are brutal and unfair, but in doing so, he conflates them with his lack of understanding about Africa. Here is a very famous map from this period, about maybe 1856. All the areas in red are the current possessions of the empire. And if we zoom into this section here, popping down, here you can see the British interest right there, Ashanti, close to that Gold Coast region. And then Abyssinia is this whole region over here. And again, places in red, right? You can kind of see those spaces of British imperial power. We meet Jerry Cruncher, who in the first chapter, right, seemed like maybe a humorous guy. And in a lot of ways, he is humorous, but his humor is comes from a place that's not very humorous for us today, namely domestic violence. His speech patterns are incredible, and it really is a shame that this character was created and then is so grotesque. Bust me if she ain't at it again. A woman of orderly and industrious appearance rose from her knees in a corner with sufficient haste and trepidation to show that she was the person referred to. What? Said Mr. Cruncher, looking out of bed for a boot. You're at it again, are you? After hailing the morn with this second salutation, he threw a boot at the woman as a third. It was a very muddy boot, and may introduce the odd circumstance connected with Mr. Cruncher's domestic economy that, whereas he often came home after banking hours with clean boots, he often got up next morning to find the same boots covered with clay. What? Said Mr. Cruncher, varying his apostrophe after missing his mark. What are you up to, Agger-a-Whiter? I was only saying my prayers. And so we're simultaneously setting up a mystery around Cruncher's boots, as well as his speech patterns and the kind of faithfulness of his wife. What I want to introduce, though, here is this idea of the faithfulness of his wife, because for a Dickens novel, it's full of women, and Dickens and women is a complicated subject. And we have a number of very interesting women already that we've been introduced to. Miss Pross, Madame Defarge, and here, Jerry Cruncher's wife. We also have Lucy, who I'll try to argue for being more interesting than she might appear at first on the page. But Cruncher's wife is really remarkable because she stays true to her religion, which in Dickens is often a sign of kind of, well, it's a personal religion that she has, right? And something like Barnaby Rudge, your adherence to the religion is meant for kind of political power. And that's not at all the case with her. She's patient, and she also endures a lot, but she doesn't have a lot of other options. And that's the thing to really point to, right? Jerry has a pretty good business, maybe more. He's an honest tradesman. And so I think thinking about her as having a lack of options and needing to make do, and how she does that can be interesting. So keep your eyes out for her. The strong thing that happens in the next chapter, I'm going to avoid a lot of the court politics, but the narrator comes out quite strongly against treating court as entertainment. This is a thing that I think easily applies today, and the rise of court TV, true crime shows, and everybody having an opinion without any knowledge. So Dickens writes, this is Cruncher, making his way through the tainted crowd, dispersed up and down this hideous scene of action with the skill of a man accustomed to make his way quietly, the messenger found out the door he sought and handed in his letter through a trap in it. For people then paid to see the play at the Old Bailey, just as they paid to see the play in Bedlam. Only the former entertainment was much the dearer. Therefore, all the Old Bailey doors were well guarded, except, indeed, the social doors by which the criminals got there, and those were always left wide open. So here we have these three terms, play, and then entertainment. play at the Old Bailey is courtroom entertainment. Sorrowfully, tragically, the play in Bedlam, Bedlam is the asylum for the mentally ill, and here you could also pay to go and see them, right? You might remember when Dickens was in America the first time, he would go and visit different institutions, including prisons, right? So this was a 19th century mode of entertainment that we find maybe quite foreign to us, distant. But even for Dickens, there's a limit to where you should be doing this. And I think even he was quite uncomfortable at times. Calling the former entertainment, right, the play at the Old Bailey, much dearer, a slight pun, right? One, it cost more to do it, but also the cost for the performer, quote unquote, is death. So it's really some powerful Dickens as social commentator moments. This also extends in the next chapter as we meet our first witness, Barsad, to the ideas of statues. And I'm going to connect this to a piece of biography. That he, Barsad, had been the prisoner's friend, but at once in an auspicious and an evil hour, detecting his infamy, had resolved to immolate the traitor he could no longer cherish in his bosom on the sacred altar of his country. That, if statues were decreed in Britain, as in ancient Greece and Rome, to public benefactors, this shining citizen would assuredly have had one. That, as they were not so decreed, he probably would not have one. So a little bit of humor, but Dickens had zero patience for statues. At the time that I'm recording this, we're a little bit past the mania for statue discussion. Who gets a statue, who doesn't, what should we do with statues? But Dickens was always firmly against it. And at this moment, right, we can read into Barsad's statement that, oh, he deserves a statue, as he's the wrong kind of person asking for a person to be recognized, right? So here's a letter that is quoted in Forster's Life in chapter 2. Forster writes, 12 months before his death, these words were written. I direct that my name be inscribed in plain English letters on my tomb. I conjure my friends on no account to make me the subject of any monument, memorial, or testimonial whatever. I rest my claim to the remembrance of my country on my published works, and to the remembrance of my friends upon their experience of me, in addition thereto. So you might take this letter as false modesty, and that's fine, but it is what he has said. Interestingly, this idea he emphasizes is the published works, and so much, of course, what we conjure and ourselves comes from his letters, which he very much desired not to be published. And I will be quoting one such letter in a little bit that had actually been suppressed for quite a number of years. Just so I don't go completely without talking about a character, Sidney has a paradox, which is he's incredibly indolent and unmoving until he is turned on. Mr. Carton, who had so long sat looking at the ceiling of the court, changed neither his place nor his attitude, even in this excitement. Right, so huge hubbub, lots of movements going back and forth, and Carton doesn't move. But then, later, yet this Mr. Carton took in more details of the scene that he appeared to take in. For now, when Miss Manette's head dropped upon her father's breast, he was the first to see it, and to say audibly, Officer, look to that young lady. Help the gentleman take her out. Don't you see she will fall? I want to emphasize the verbs here of sight. See, look, and see, right? And that's what he does. He is a witness to things. And this is the first time he speaks. And he speaks, maybe he's been mumbling under his breath and things like that. He has also written, so a form of speech, but now he's out loud and it's full of excitement, right? 2 exclamation marks, imperatives, an apostrophe, officer, direct address, command, look, help, and then don't you see, again, she will fall. So Carton's energy activates when Lucy is in need. So that's just something to keep in mind. It's not a subtle point, but it's there. Charles, for instance, was not the one to see. Later on, we turn to Carton working for Stryver. So he's gotten drunk, he threw a glass, he talked to Darnay, and now he goes to work. And we learn all about drinking. It was a hard drinking time then. The learned profession of the law was certainly not behind any other learned profession in its bacchanalian propensities. Neither was Mr. Stryver, already fast shouldering his way to a large and lucrative practice, behind his compeers in this particular any more than in the drier parts of the legal race. And then later, even there, they prolonged their usual orgies late into the night. Carton was rumored to be seen at broad day, going home stealthily and unsteadily to his lodgings like a dissipated cat. So I want to talk about these words, bacchanalian and orgies. Bacchanalian referring to Bacchus, so the Greek god of wine and revelry, but also Bacchus was famous for a series of mysteries that revolved around him. So there were these orgies, right? And the origin of orgy is not a sex party, but rather a secret rites or sacred rites that you would conduct for religion and religious purposes. And so here, the two of them are involved in this process just of like dealing with the court and the documents, but we steep it in the language of classicism, and specifically Eastern religion that had kind of moved into first Greece and then into Rome. So bacchanalian seems like a pretty general word. However, given the context of ideas of transformation and living on the edge of society, it becomes a little bit more powerful if you think about Euripides's Bacchae, well, which is also a play deeply concerned with uncovering secrets and improper use of your power. Sidney Carton reflects on his time in Paris with Stryver. Before Shrewsbury, and at Shrewsbury, and never since Shrewsbury, pursued Carton, you have fallen into your rank, and I have fallen into mine. Even when we were fellow students in the student quarter of Paris, picking up French and French law and other French crumbs that we didn't get much good of, you were always somewhere, and mine was always nowhere. So what are these French crumbs? Well, I want to suggest that they are venereal diseases. And interestingly, at the same time of composition, on the 25th of June, 1859, Dickens had written to his doctor, Frank Beard. This is a letter that had previously been suppressed. My bachelor's state has engendered a small malady on which I want to see you. I'm at Gad's Hill for the summer, but I've come up to London this morning on purpose. So at this point, it's generally accepted that this is gonorrhea or syphilis that he has been suffering from. And so I think this parallel, right, it's like Carton is talking about what it was like to be a young man in Paris, right? A bachelor day. And so just a little bit of sex in this novel that I think tries really hard to suppress it, but tries way too hard, as we're going to see with Lucy. But that'll be after this. First, just a technical literary term, so we can cover it, right? Literary atmosphere is when mood matches character. So think about if there's a fight scene, it's much more dramatic when it's raining and there's thunder happening. Or if a character is sad, you've probably seen it a million times, but it rains. And that's what we have here as our dissipated cat walks home. When his host followed him out on the staircase with a candle to light him down the stairs, the day was coldly looking in through its grimy windows. So right there, even there, we have personification. The day was looking coldly. When he got out of the house, the air was cold and sad. Well, yeah, the air might be cold, but air can't be sad. So it's personified, but it's also atmospheric, right? It's Sydney who is cold and sad. The dull sky overcast, the river dark and dim, the whole scene like a lifeless desert. And wreaths of dust were spinning round and round before the morning blast, as if the desert sand had risen far away, and the first spray of it in its advance had begun to overwhelm the city. So really another interesting thing here with this lifeless desert that then they pick up, but then it talks about the desert overwhelming the city. So a little bit of language of invasion, right, that's happening. If you think about some of what's to come in this story, but also just what's happening more broadly, fear of desert, right? This might connect back to our, at least our Abyssinian references. So, or even Britain's presence in Egypt. All right, here's the thing I don't know what to say about, but it comes up twice, that Dr. Manette Experiments, and we'll see the other reference later. Dr. Manette received such patience here as his old reputation and its revival and the floating whispers of his story brought him. His scientific knowledge and his vigilance and skill in conducting ingenious experiments brought him otherwise into moderate request, and he earned as much as he wanted. So this is a book that's full of dead bodies and ideas of life and death and what sparks energy. So I don't know, is he sitting around and maybe experimenting with some of those things, maybe working with some chemicals at the time? It's unexplicated and it's incredibly mysterious. So anything at all that you can kind of think about with the 19th century and scientific experiment that Dr. Manette, as an immigrant, but also somebody that's been out of practice, right, for 18 years, 23 years, what is he experimenting? And is he bringing his old training to bear in the new world? But this is the main thing I want to spend time on, which is last week, or in the previous video, we talked about the Negro Cupids, right? Comparing kind of a Black sexuality to Lucy's whiteness, purity. But people try really hard to suppress her sexuality. And Miss Pross is one of the main ones to do that. But she also, at the same time, draws attention to it. That's why I'm using this language of sublimation. So sublimation is kind of the Hegelian Aufhebung, right? You push something down and you lift it up at the same time. So she says, really is bad enough, returned Miss Pross, but better. Yes, I am very much put out. May I ask the cause? I don't want dozens of people who are not all worthy of Ladybird to come here looking for her, said Miss Pross. Do dozens come for that purpose? Hundreds, said Miss Pross. It was characteristic of this lady, as of some other people before her time and since, that whenever her original proposition was questioned, she exaggerated it. Dear me, said Mr. Lorry as the safest remark he could think of. Right, so Pross is talking about suitors coming, and she's saying dozens, and then she elevates it to hundreds. So she's talking about this being kind of an overwhelming number of people that are pursuing Lucy. We then have this passage right here. On Sundays, Miss Pross dined at the doctor's table, but on other days persisted in taking her meals at unknown periods, either in the lower region or in her own chamber on the second floor, a blue chamber to which no one but her Ladybird ever gained admittance. So this is a reference to Bluebeard. Bluebeard, of course, famous for marrying a woman, saying, don't go into this chamber. The woman gives into temptation, goes into the chamber, finds all of Bluebeard's dead wives, and then is killed in turn. So it's very much a story of like guarding sexuality, but also like periods of jealousy. And Miss Pross is the person running the blue chamber. So is she keeping Lucy protected? Is she the threat to the men? Is it like a reverse Bluebeard? It's complicated, but the point I want to emphasize is not so much we're finding a one-to-one correlation, but it's a story about sexuality. We then meet the only two suitors that there actually are. 104, Mr. Darnay presented himself while they were sitting under the plane tree, but he was only one. Notice that capital O on one, bringing us back to the suitor, right? It's like a title. And then Mr. Carton had lounged in, but he made only two. There again, we have that capital letter, the identifying the two of them as suitors, but also as competition. So we don't really see Lucy addressing these things, but instead we see it all happening around her. We also see a fun meta-literary moment about how do you begin things. So this maybe makes me think of like Dickens starting a new novel on page 99 in the Penguin. Not seeing with precision what was very hard, Mr. Lorry shook his head, using that important part of himself as a sort of fairy cloak that would fit anything. All sorts of people who are not in the least degree worthy of the pet are always turning up, said Miss Pross. When you began it, I began it, Miss Pross, didn't you? Who brought her father to life? Oh, if that was beginning it, said Mr. Lorry, it wasn't ending it, I suppose. I say when you began it, it was hard enough. So here are the two of them, right, commenting on the origins of this book itself, which is, when did it begin? With that recalled to life of Dr. Manette. So I think it's just a fun winking reference to when does a serial publication begin. Back to some more problematic language. Here, the narrator is talking about Miss Pross. Mr. Lorry knew Miss Pross to be very jealous, but he also knew her by this time to be, beneath the service of her eccentricity, one of those unselfish creatures found only among women who will, for pure love and admiration, bind themselves willing slaves to youth when they have lost it, to beauty that they never had, to accomplishments that they were never fortunate enough to gain, to bright hopes that never shone upon their own somber lives. So I said this was the narrator, but it's also kind of free and direct discourse of Mr. Lorry's mentality. And what I want to point out here is the kind of grotesque paradox of a willing slave. It's a fantasy in the eyes of slaveholders. And then how it compares, right? All of these things are negatives next to the idea of slavery, whether it's youth, beauty, and accomplishments and hope. So it's a perverse statement, right? But it shows us in Lorry's head, really, as a white middle-class British banker. Yeah, he would have this kind of thought, not thinking of those who have lived their lives enslaved. And if you think about the time period that we're in, right, we're before 1814 and the abolishment of slavery, because we're in 1780. So that's all happening in the background as well. Point here that I want to bring up, this is chapter 2.6, page 103, and it's on Pross's cooking. Largely a passage that I think we're meant to find humorous, and on the surface it is. But then when we dig into it, some problems emerge. Problems of, if you've listened to anything that I have ever talked about, imperialism. In the arrangements of the little household, Miss Pross took charge of the lower regions and always acquitted herself marvelously. Her dinners, of a very modest quality, were so well cooked and so well served and so neat in their contrivances, half English and half French, that nothing could be better. Miss Pross's friendship being of the thoroughly practical kind, she had ravaged Soho and the adjacent provinces in search of impoverished French, who, tempted by shillings and half-crowns, would impart culinary mysteries to her. From these decayed sons and daughters of Gaul, she had acquired such wonderful arts that the woman and girl who formed the staff of domestics regarded her as quite a sorceress, or Cinderella's godmother, who would send out for a fowl, a rabbit, a vegetable or two from the garden, and change them into anything she pleased. Right, this is the language of imperial resource extraction. Miss Pross, the proper British woman, goes and just throws things together, makes this melange, this mix, and she does it by expropriating from people that are suffering. So right here, we have this idea, even calling it practical, but she ravaged Soho, right? And then we use the language of provinces. That's territory, right? It's not neighborhoods, it's not districts, it's provinces. Provinces is an imperial term, right? You might think of Roman provinces. So she's getting resources, but she's also getting intellectual knowledge, which is one of the things that happens when you conquer other regions, right? You conquer culture at the same time. And who she's going after is the impoverished French, who she's then going to pay, but pay hardly anything in exchange for culinary mysteries. So if you think back to that idea of the Bacchanalian orgy and cultural mystery that exists, she's taking people's ancestral knowledge, applying it to herself, and then presenting it to the household as though she has created it. So definitely a point of appropriation here. And the sons and daughters of Gaul, right, are now being called decayed. That use even of Gaul brings us back into kind of a Roman imperialism that she's running. And it's like, oh yeah, she acquired such wonderful arts from these people. It's like celebrating this practice. All right, sorry about that. And right, instead of it being normalized, like a thing a human does, the people under her, right, this staff, see her as a sorceress or a Cinderella's godmother. So we turn imperialism into fable and fantasy. All right, on to some illustrations. Here we have The likeness, here's Cruncher, kind of fun that he's in the middle. And these are supposed to be Darnay up in the witness stand and Sydney. This, of course, does not happen in the book. They never kind of look at each other face on. So it's a peculiarity that then gets adopted. Maybe in the nose, they look a little bit alike, but otherwise, it's such a strange thing to have wanted to show, because the viewer is going to immediately try to identify pinpoints that are the same, and they will fail in doing so. Here's the congratulations. Really kind of a marvelous series. Here we have Stryver, really large hand out, stretched there. This is Laurie in the background. Here is Darnay looking just at Stryver, not even seeing behind him, but there's Dr. Manette fading away into the background. Here's Lucy taking up a huge amount of space, looking towards Darnay. And then behind them, we have Sydney here in the shadows, in the dark, his hair all loose, his neckerchief kind of undone, even his coat looking a little awry in comparison to his double. But Sydney is the one looking at Lucy. So if you think about where is the gaze happening. Then we're going to look briefly at the Harper's Illustrations by McLennan. Here, chapter 1, we have Jerry Cruncher under the bank, and then the large scene of the domestic situation, Cruncher reaching for the boot to throw at his wife. Then chapter 3, it's the court case one. So this is supposed to be Sydney, right? Head back, leaning up, probably the most unattractive Sydney you'll encounter. And this maybe is Darnay looking out at him. Here's a prisoner as double, which were this not labeled, I would think this was trying to be Stryver. Very unfortunate looking fellow. Here, the two of them are next to each other that you can see. So it's kind of imitating, but with the goal here as well. But it's interesting because, as far as I know, McLennan wouldn't have had access to what all these details were, because he was writing just a week after, but Fizz had a chance to do the illustrations for the end of the month. So my suspicion then would be it's the other way around, that maybe Fizz is modeling his on McLennan's. Here is chapter 4, congratulatory. So this scene right here is Sydney sleeping it off after his confrontation with Darnay, and then the lion and the jackal being for the next chapter. This is Stryver all dissipated, and here's Sydney with his head wrappings hard at work, going through the different legal papers and preparing the briefs for Stryver. And then the last ones, this is for the last chapter, 6. Here is Cruncher leading Laurie home. And then we have Laurie and Pross. Pross with the outfit with a lot of echoes of Cruncher's wife. Here's a nice bird cage in the background indicating that this is Lucy's room that they are in. The last thing I want to talk about is, again, these are being published in America right at the beginning of the Italian Revolution. And so you would be reading these paragraphs where you read something like this, perhaps see the great crowd of people with its rush and roar bearing down upon them too, and then to turn the page and see images from the battles that are happening. So we all know that A Tale of Two Cities is leading up towards revolution, and the American audience is reading these in the midst of images of revolution being published. It's absolutely an astonishing combination. So that's everything that I have for you. I hope that I drew out some maybe elements that you've overlooked in the past and are starting to see this novel a little bit differently than you have in the past.